Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Marty Momgen, Healthcare Solutions Advisor with Sirius Healthcare. Quick round of introduction for our expert panelists and seasoned veterans. Former FBI agent and now distinguished cybersecurity technologist with HP Enterprises, Office of the CTO, James Morrison.
Nice to meet you.
A quick intro, James.
Yeah, so as kind of introduced, my name is James Morrison. Just retired in December after a 22-year career with the FBI. Last date working cybercrime here in the Houston area. So I had a lot of exposure to the medical center down here and working with healthcare. And really what my role has been is to help have conversations around cybersecurity from a customer perspective. So it's not necessarily just HPE products, but also just trying to get to solution sets. My job is to sort of keep an eye on the conversations that are out there. So for example, we had the universal health attack yesterday, and how does that apply to customers? How can we help have the right conversation to make sure that we're helping you get to a secure environment? So that's really my role, and I'm hoping to kind of add something good into this today.
Thank you, James. Our next panelist, co-vice chair of IEEE standards for clinical IoT data and device interoperability, and Indiana University Health Chief Information Security Officer, Mitch Parker.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Mitch Parker. I'm the Executive Director / CISO at IU Health, back with a background in medical device security and also done a lot of work in threat hunting and large-scale data analysis. Very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mitch. And last but not least, one of my favorite leaders in the healthcare IT community, Chief Information Security Officer and the gentleman who always inches the bar ever higher in healthcare IT security, Carl West from Intermountain Health.
Thanks, Marty, and good afternoon to all of you. I am happy to join this group and to share a few thoughts and ideas. I'm from Intermountain Healthcare. We're an integrated delivery system. We own hospitals, we own clinics, home care, hospice, pharmacy, insurance, and that's what keeps me up at night. And those things James just mentioned, those are the things we're watching every day. That ransomware attack, those are the difficult threats that we all have to deal with. So I'm happy to join the group. Thanks, Marty.
Thanks, Carl. So just to catch everybody up on what's going on so far this year, specifically for healthcare organizations, IT security and risk. Of course, it's the year 2020. The stress and burden on healthcare organizations are greater than ever. Our clinicians, providers, caregivers are working around the clock, stretch their limits, taking care of patients during the pandemic. At the same time, IT support, operational support, administrative staff are essentially a remote workforce now. Healthcare organizations this year are rapidly adopting and leveraging hybrid cloud to deliver critical IT services. What we're seeing is a significant increase in the deployment of technology, services, and workloads, both in public cloud, private cloud, and all to support, work from home, mobile clinicians, telemedicine. And at the same time, healthcare organizations have to lower the cost of IT operations and improve security posture. Healthcare right now is a big target. Ransomware attacks are at an all-time high. The World Health Organization just reported dealing with 5 times the amount of cyber attacks that they deal with on a daily and weekly basis. And now, on top of everything, to continue the trend that is 2020, we are dealing with the infamous zero logon vulnerability that is hitting not just healthcare, but across all industries. To kick things off, so remote workforce and cybersecurity during a pandemic. Let's start with you, James. What's the difference? Did you see any shifts in priorities, technology, or risk in any way once our, essentially workforce went home?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I call this the largest unplanned IT transformation in the history of IT. Whatever plans companies, and healthcare is a good example, had in January went out the window on March, whatever day you want to call it, when the lockdown occurred. Every company said, I just have to stay up. I have to make sure that I'm staying, my day-to-day operations are continuing. So they just sent people home and tried to tune up VPN gateways, Citrix gateways. I know healthcare groups that set up their colo locations as they went hot with them and are starting to use those as full blown. But what that means is it means security wasn't built into that conversation. It was just staying resilient, staying up. So as things, if they calm down, we have to start having a better conversation around security, because the other issue is that a lot of the security models that we had built into our enterprises weren't designed around a large-scale remote workforce. Remote workforces were somewhere between 6 and 8% prior to the COVID pandemic, but now it's going to settle in somewhere between 45 and 55%. So we have to have a really good sit down and evaluate whether or not what we did is right, and is it going to be able to leverage going forward. FBI had reported back in March and April 150% increase in ransomware attacks. Every crisis will induce more attacks. We saw that even in I'm out of the Houston area. We saw that even in Tropical Storm Beta recently. We saw that last year with Tropical Storm Imelda. These criminal groups will see when somebody is in crisis, and they see it as an opportunity to probably turn that into a revenue stream. And they will definitely try to leverage more attacks. Because there's also a 400% increase in scamming attacks against home computers especially, that means that home users are even more targeted by these attacks, and home networks are notoriously insecure. And so you're allowing these remote networks to log into your network through something like a VPN tunnel. You have no ability to secure any of that endpoint. So endpoint security is going to become increasingly a conversation around all of our security needs, especially as a remote workforce becomes more of our reality.
Perfect. Thanks, James. Carl, what about you? Any priorities change? Did you see a risk?
COVID has been a significant shift. And I think for every healthcare, I think that's maybe the understatement of what I'll present. Excuse me, but certainly as we went right into COVID, at the beginning of COVID, my job shifted and my daily job began 2 to 3 hours every day looking at what was happening in healthcare, trying to understand old processes, new processes, old technologies, new needs for technologies. And I would share with the group that prior to COVID, Intermountain was trying to lead the transformation. So we had a huge leg up in that we had our caregivers enabled. We had multiple tools in place that would deliver care remotely, but the pandemic shifted so much. So we spent the first few weeks and months sitting in a huddle, 30 leaders of the organization, looking at new needs, new processes, new tools, and for me, it meant a whole host of COVID risks, I call them. And I would tell you, as we're here today talking about the risk inventory, your risk registers, we have built a COVID risk inventory. And that's a list of everything that we did differently in COVID that we have to go back later and say, is that something that we want to persist or something that we want to undo, rewind? And so we're tracking that currently. I think as we look at this conversation in terms of what changed for all of us, the perimeter, the firewall, the VPN, the VDI, those have changed, and multi-factor. And again, in all of those areas, I think at Intermountain, we had a pretty significant investment. I felt prepared. I didn't feel a lot of anxiety, but we had to do some things differently. As an example, our VPN had to double in capacity as we've gone through this environment and this shift. And what that means is I had to start doing a reverse proxy. I had to start monitoring in places and locations that were outside of the perimeter. So our perimeter has expanded significantly. Prior to COVID, we were delivering 200,000 to 300,000 remote care experiences. That means outside of our bricks and mortar. Today, that number has skyrocketed, and we expect it to continue. And I think, and besides that perimeter and the changes, the workstations, we had people who picked up and took workstations home. if your workstation policies and classifications are like ours, I quickly recognized I had workstation classification and controls that were for inside the perimeter. I had to go back and shift. So every device had to be quickly re-imaged for an outside of the perimeter. Certainly where there were laptops, mobile devices, that wasn't an issue. But when people tried to pick up one of our desktops that was one of 13, 14 workstation classifications that were inside the perimeter, we had to rework that process. And I think for us, those have been some significant adjustments during this COVID time, and the priorities have shifted, and certainly breaking down some barriers, things that we weren't willing to consider that we now have had to reconsider, things that we've had to reach out to partners and say, if you could just do this one thing, we'd be okay with a residual risk that looks a little different than it does right now. So does that help, Marty?
I wanted to piggyback off what you're saying, because first of all, I want to commend you for doing something that I've not seen a lot of companies doing, keeping those notes. We have a lot of lessons to learn in what happened that need to be considered at the post, whenever we get to that point. And I think that's a beautiful idea that needs to really be considered across. Keep track of what you learned, what worked, what didn't work. Because one of the biggest conversations we've had with companies is the idea of virtual desktop infrastructures. And healthcare organizations weren't necessarily thinking about that because, well, everybody's here in the house, right? Everybody's home. But now, because of remote workforce, those are conversations we have more now of, how do I actually deploy a virtual desktop infrastructure? How do I deploy a remote app in a private cloud or into a hybrid cloud? Because you absolutely hit on the problem. What about if somebody picked up a laptop and took it home? Was that laptop really provisioned for being a home use? What if people are using home computers? Can I really prove that that data is going to be secure going forward? And whether it's HIPAA or whether it's even going into more consumer privacy laws, like CCPA goes live right in the middle of all this. And there's going to be a ton of challenges as to how that's going to be applied going forward. So I thought that was a great, nice one to really commend you on that.
Yeah, and especially with the remote workers that take their workstations home at the end of the day, you're essentially pushing your perimeter out in your area of responsibility to the remote network, right?
Absolutely.
And
VPN's a great example of that, because VPN, depending upon how the connectivity is monitored, is really connecting that home network to your network. And if you're not sniffing that traffic to actually validate that that data has not been corrupted, there's all sorts of attack surface that come out of there. So it's not just about extending VPN to that network, but changing the way you monitor it.
Definitely. And Mitch, how about you? Any shift in priorities, technology, risk?
Oh, absolutely. So the number one area we focused on was more about the threats and the risk profile, because your risk profile completely changed. The types of threats were aiming more towards your users who are now at home, and a large portion of your network protection was no longer effective. So we had to retool on the fly, and the number of, give you an example, domain spoofing attacks that we saw went up by a factor of 5 in the first week. The number of scams we had coming in were fast and furious. And we also had to deal with the issue that a very large portion of our workforce was on crappy home routers. Your average home router gets about 12 to 18 months of security patches. We've had a campaign going at IU Health for the past 4 years where we tell people, if you get a new computer for Christmas, put a new router under the tree along with it, because your 15-year-old Linksys WRT 54GS is not going to handle modern Wi-Fi. Heck, it couldn't handle multiple computers connecting to YouTube now with the anemic CPU it has. So we took a look at it. The threat profile completely changed. We do use two-factor, we use VPN, we use VDI, but all that is all for naught if the users can't connect. So we had to suddenly become very good at explaining to how home internet connections and home routers worked, and making sure that people had what they needed, because in addition to us working from home, people had their spouses working from home and their children taking classes. And those Chromebooks are not exactly light on the bandwidth. So you have to keep a lot of items in consideration. And also, the risk completely shifted. So you have to make sure you're getting logs and data off of these devices. You make sure you have analysts looking at those logs. And for those threats coming out fast and furious, you have analysts staffed and looking at them. And more important, I'm going to bring this up, you have your internal teams communicating around the clock, because you don't know when something's going to hit. And again, we talk a lot about all these great new vulnerabilities and great new 0 days. There's a saying I have, which is people only use what they need to, and they're not going to burn a 0 day if they don't have to. And what I've seen with many of these attacks is that they use old techniques because they work. They use what they need to get in. They use what they need to work, and we make it very easy for them in healthcare. So part of our job is to make it harder for them to get in. And sadly, it comes down to what I like to tell my boss, it's called running from zombies. If we're both running from zombies, I only have to run faster than you. So that's pretty much how we take a look at healthcare security. But yes, we've had some pretty significant changes due to COVID, and a pretty huge paradigm shift, as I like to call it.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, especially if you're under attack by zombies. Just carry banana peels around with you, throw them right behind you, make sure they don't hit you, don't get caught off guard. So risk assessment, risk inventory, risk profiling, incident response. When everybody is on-prem, processes and policies are in place. But with the remote workforce in the current situation, how do you manage things? How do you manage your risk inventory and incident response?
Well, I think it's still going to come down to the same idea. I mean, you're going to, first of all, like an incident response plan, a good plan has to hope to plan for the things that you didn't think about, right? And I would say that early on, when we started having a remote workforce, it's probably a good idea for those chief risk officers and those people like the IT managers and security officers to have sat down and kind of trying to quantify that risk. It's not, we can't do it all, but that's why I like incident response plans, for example. Incident response plan, a lot of companies have them and never tested them. And if you found yourself at the beginning of this pandemic never testing your incident response plan, guess what? You just found yourself, now even more behind the 8 ball. So when this thing kind of goes forward, having a risk assessment, have you even assessed what remote workforce looks like? And Carl, I thought, brought up some, and both Mitch and Carl brought up some great conversations there. What additional, how would a remote workforce tag into your network? How would they connect in? And if they're connecting in through VPN, what additional risk do I now accept? And IoT is not just, when you have a remote workers tagging into your network, IoT is not just your IoT now it's home IoT. So now that Ring doorbell just became one of your things that you have to evaluate as a possible risk assessment. So it's really having an evaluation along all of that. And I think you're also going to see a huge conversation going forward on more of a zero trust environment. A lot more healthcare organizations have been saying, you know what, we got to think about, deploying a different technology to make sure that, something that normally acts like a video camera doesn't all of a sudden act like a different device. And so shadow IT just became a huge monster, because now shadow IT is all of those devices at home that are also connecting in. So risk has to be continually assessed, and I think now would be the time to sit down and figure out what you are risking.
Yeah, and James, this is Carl, and I would just add that the data inventory has changed. You made the comment that the risk inventory has changed, but the data inventory has changed. And so we need to be updating both instruments in our environment. And as you look at that, your playbooks, your processes should have been changing. We restructured our scanning in the SOC. Most of the processes, most of the playbooks in our SOC had been designed for inside of the perimeter. But many things that you just mentioned, James, occurred to us as we started this process. We recognized that our conversations now were being recorded by Alexa and by Google Home, and home routers were transporting information. We had to make sure no one was outside of a VPN or a VDI connection. That meant our SOC had to change. It meant that I had to go back and say my detection processes have to see, does someone have a device that is connecting outside of the VPN? And that meant we had to go back and say, let's make sure everyone is now, because they're outside of the perimeter, everyone must be using multi-factor at this point. And that created a little bit of concern. I think 75 or 80% of our users did have VPN and they did have a VDI, but we didn't have everyone in that environment. So the inventory changed. The home network now has to be considered. The coffee shop network, the Nests, the IoT, the refrigerator, that's all digital at this point, all of those things. At the same time, you have to consider your policies. And we had to go back and spend quite a bit of time looking at policy to see our work from home policy. We had it, we had one in place, but we had to clarify some things. We had to go back and specify the language around the data we did or didn't want in a home. We believed that was clear, but when we saw things moving home, we fortunately had DLP in place to realize there were home networks. And while we thought that was blocked, it was inside the perimeter. And so we quickly detected, because of DLP motion, that was inappropriate. And while we thought we had policy, we had to go back and revisit that policy. Then we had to look at the shared access that may be occurring across the network, across devices in a sophisticated technical home. The viewing that may be occurring in an unsophisticated home where they didn't have the resources needed to have our caregiver in their home and someone was over the shoulder doing schoolwork, but also seeing the imaging or the lab result of potentially a neighbor or someone like that. And so additional controls needed to be considered. And then we had to consider, as we looked at risk, what does remote work mean? If I said you're going to go home and I sent you home, does remote mean that you could work from the soccer field? Does it mean you could go to grandma's house and spend 3 days and work at grandma's house? Does it mean if you had a motorhome, you could hop in the motorhome and be driving across the country? And now I have to consider, where is my data, and do I have state regulations, and has it moved and transfers? And if someone was even more creative and decided they wanted to go spend 2 months in Mexico and then fly over and spend 2 months and wait out the quarantine in Spain, does that comprehend what remote means to intermountain? And is it what we wanted? And I would tell you that we're having those discussions, and we're not uncomfortable with many of those things, but we do believe the risk profile changes when I move from within an area where I have licensing and within an area where I have tax ability to comprehend what's going on, where I understand the state regulations. It also changes when the data is shifted offshore, and so the controls necessarily have to change. So we have adjusted and sent out guidelines about what remote does and doesn't mean, and we're not uncomfortable. I think in the longer term, we see ways we can accomplish all of the things that I just mentioned. But when you look at the controls, you have to look at a broader set of issues. Similarly, as we went home, we recognized that the devices that may have the ability to do print and copy, that's not legally sound, and we don't have ability to track the motion of that data that ends up in a home, on a home network, on a printer, outside of our control, and we don't know where that data motion occurs. So we had to create new processes, new tools. That happened. We had capabilities. We just didn't have it disciplined. It wasn't documented. We had to get the control, get the process, and then make sure the policy matched for print, for digital copy, for signing in a home, and then making sure in our security operations center we had ability to detect all of the new data inventory, all of the new risk, all the new device that had just shifted into a mobile remote environment that many people were taking liberties with, which I actually am in favor of and not wanting to discourage. And even as the CISO, I think we ought to be able to find ways to enable what has happened through COVID and change the future of our own workplace.
You said it a couple of times, and I just want to jump on that real quick. Our security has to be more data focused. And I talk to companies and they'll say my network is secure. That's not what we're focusing on. We need to focus on the data and the data flow and data in all of its states. So data at rest, data in motion, and data in memory. And so what we have to start, because you're absolutely right. I think what's going to happen is this is going to be an explosion of remote data. And data is going to push closer to the edge than we ever talked about before. But how do we secure it? And that's why we've always talked about, at HP is that how do I push my data security all the way to the absolute edge where it's being created? Because I think it said by 2025, 75% of our data will be created outside of the data center. And most of that data is left at the edge. It's not used for anything. And so as we push data closer, we can start generating new revenue streams on that data. And there's incredible amounts of revenue stream from location data, sensor data that you might be collecting on IoT type devices, all of those kind of things. So I think I like that, and I think we need to continue that focus of data security and making sure that we have security that is built in, not bolted on.
Yeah, James, and that's why I use that concept, that idea of the data inventory. So many people in our business are getting focused on creating an inventory of asset, an inventory of device, but the focus has to shift to the inventory of the data, where the data lives, where it resides. And for that to be successful, the data inventory has to be married directly to and go hand in hand with the risk inventory. Your risk inventory is an assessment of the data inventory. And around that inventory, you've got to have classification of the data. That specifies the controls. And you look at the data, where's the motion, where's the location, where's it storing, how's it moving? That is the key concept, and especially as we go remote, that's the key to consider here.
Mitch,
give it to us, Mitch.
Your thoughts?
So there's one other factor here which we ran into, which is the third-party vendors. Because let me put it to you this way, most of your data now is in the cloud. Most of your data is outside of your four walls and outside of your control. One item that came up was not only the third-party vendors that have domestic operations, it is the ones with international ones. And international companies had different ways of responding to COVID than domestic ones. So we took the approach, and we've taken the approach published in our website, of we are very strict about how we handle any data outside of the United States, because it is a reality that every large multi-billion-dollar company you deal with will have a business unit outside of the United States that will be handling your data. And the basic economics dictates that is the case. So it has been a big change for us. Well, first of all, we had a large amount of people working remotely before, even part-time. So it was not as much of a shift to get people working remotely, because we had already had that use case working pretty significantly with people working remotely due to several other types of issues we had before. A couple of years ago, they did major roadway work by where our IT department's at, and because of that, we had a lot of prep work because we let people work remotely for a couple of months because the highway was closed. And we didn't want people dealing with traffic, so we had them work remotely. However, with third-party vendors, that is something where you just can't call up and get a risk score for them. You have to have an ongoing dialogue with your vendors, because a lot of them don't understand what requirements are, or they say they'll take best efforts to secure your data. And realistically, best effort and what's expected in the HIPAA security rule and what's expected with where that data is actually stored are multiple different items. And unless you're actually out there talking to these vendors and having conversations about where the data is going, how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be manipulated, and how you're going to protect it from being exfiltrated in countries that have legislation that is biased towards their own citizens in the case of a data breach, and make it impossible for people outside that country to, well, have any kind of recourse. You really have to think about it. And I'm building on everything Carl said. It's the absolute truth. This is what we've had to do. So this has been a complete change in how we respond and how we evaluate third parties and how we take a look at where our data is at, because ultimately our data is like everyone else. It no longer resides in our data center, and every other healthcare organization, it's the same exact thing. It's just that some are talking about it publicly, others aren't.
Yeah, and cybersecurity requirements have to be pushed down those contracts. It's becoming more and more the requirement. There's a statistic that says in 2019, only 15% of subcontractors reported a breach up to their up channel. They're not going to report it unless it's required. It's got to be built in there. If it's not, it's a pain. And so many of the breaches we see, from Target forward, have been based upon a subcontractor that just didn't have good cybersecurity. So I absolutely think that those relationships have to be the reality.
Yeah, if I just could add to James, that's such a great point. In the middle of COVID, to have these partner breaches is just staggering, and many of us today, because of what happened at UHS, are looking at where we may have a physician or an affiliated physician who is inside of a UHS facility. And I know I have spent many phone calls yesterday, today, briefing leaders about what this means and how we have IOCs and those words of an IOC. Many people, even cyber, don't understand what an IOC is. And I tell them, this is like what we're looking for here that's happened at UHC. We know the IOCs, we have them, we're scanning. And it's like our caregivers looking for in the body fluids of a patient, they're looking for COVID, and they can understand that. And we know the difference between COVID and the flu. And I tell them in cyber, we know the difference between Ryuk and other things, and we can scan for those IOCs. That's a significant risk that has occurred in the middle of what's happening here with our remote work. And for us, as I listened to Mitch and what you're saying, I'm thinking this has been a significant thing for us to notice that our partners are affecting us in a significant way. And our business leaders don't understand when they sign an agreement what the level of risk is. And while we complete a review and we assess what could be and should be in contract, there's a number of things that I just share with you that are critical points that you should be looking at this point. And I'll, besides what has happened with the impact with the UHS just here recently, 6 partners of Intermountain have been breached during COVID. And that has caused great shock at a leadership level in Intermountain, because they assume and make an assumption that everyone is doing security at the same level. And so for me to go and explain that really there are small, medium, and large healthcare organizations, and there are small, medium, and large efforts being put into cybersecurity. And they don't always match. Sometimes you have very small organizations doing big things and very big organizations taking very little effort relative to cyber. So the maturity, the compliance that's out there is a shock to our leaders at this time. And I think 2 efforts have to be made. And I would encourage, as you look at your risk, look at the risk associated with the third parties. You should have, it's a best practice to have an inventory of third parties. And that's a 1 to N list of every third party. I have over 6,000 in my inventory list. Everyone is listed, and we list them as critical, high, moderate, or low. We list the inherent, we list the residual risk, we list the controls that were specified in a contract. But I think if you leave that there and do what we've talked about, you've fallen short, because the other part of third-party assessment is, what did you do after the contract was signed in terms of following up? Doing the assessment to say, are they being compliant to the language that you put into the contract? And are they managing the data? Are you scanning to see what breaches occurred, to see if your partners have been in a breach? And then do you have conversations? In each of the cases that we've had, I've been involved personally with 6 CISOs. We've talked about their program, not in a critical way, but in a partnering way. What happened? How can I help? Here's some things we have done. Have you done these things? And where it's necessary to have the conversation, this is an expectation of a partner. We don't understand why you didn't have multi-factor in place. Why would that identity have been compromised even if there was a phish attack? And so the pre-purchase, the post-purchase, all those are important kinds of things, and understanding the risk and sharing that back with leaders is a critical thing, because they're shocked when they find that not all of healthcare is operating at the same standard.
Well, and you hit the nail on the small and the mediums, right? You got the people feeding into you. So you've got these small medical offices that are feeding into your system, and they may have a part-time IT person that shows up once a week and makes sure that the computers are running. And how do you evaluate risk at that level, where you have 2 doctors and a staff and maybe a couple nurses versus a full-scale hospital, but at the same time they've all got the same access into your network. They all need that same access in order to be able to do their job, and so yeah, and you can't necessarily expect the same, but you want the same, right? So or how do you roll them into your security model? We know some hospitals, for example, have used like GreenLake, which is a thing that we use from a data use standpoint, and they've actually been able to extend the GreenLake access into small and medium businesses or small and medium healthcare organizations. So it's really about what risk it comes down to risk. Life comes down to risk. What are you willing to accept by allowing this group to come into your network? And if you're willing to accept that, what happens when it breaks? What's your back action that you may have to take in order to make sure that can you mitigate that risk? Because it's going to come down to that too.
And I can add on to that as well. And a major challenge we've had is, yes, we've been able to explain this to our leadership, because we've had the good security requirements in our contracts now going on several years. And what we found is it's not just small companies. There's a lot of really large companies out there that, when I mention some of the security standards out there, don't get it. And I'll be very clear about this. Part of the only reason I'm able to get the answers I am is because I put on that little IEEE hat I have for being a co-vice chair of a working group and say, I can get your principal engineers on the phone. And I've had to do that. And that's not good, because I need to be able to get answers for what the risks really are. And what I've found is that a lot of the third parties don't have the engineering talent I need to help out with the contracts, talking with the team actually doing the contract. And that actually gets more profound the larger the organization gets.
Well, and that's why even using things like one thing we're kind of looking at is the whole EPIC framework, the EPIC, or some sort of framework that give them a thing to look at. Tell me what you're doing. Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing multi-factor authentication? Yes or no? I mean, if they lie on it at a minimum, it's a contractual issue at that point. But if you identify what your requirements are all the way down from criticality down, then at the very least, when you go to your leadership, you can say, yeah, this group's logging in, but based upon their whatever, they're yes on all the criticals, and they have a couple of minors that we'd like to get them. I mean, but we have to have those conversations at the front end, not the back end.
Absolutely, and we've been having them at the front end. And again, like I said, it's more surprising. Smaller companies, startups are more than willing to put in the work to work with us. A lot of larger companies are the ones that balk more than the smaller ones at our controls. And we've vetted our controls with numerous people in our organization and our attorneys. So we do this not to say everyone's going to be really secure, but because we want to make sure for the criticality of the data that we are of the patient's data, because we don't look at it as our data, it belongs to our patients. What we entrust others to do to make sure we entrust them to keep our patients' data safe, and we keep that mindset and focus. And again, smaller companies get it, larger companies take a longer time.
You know, Marty, if we come full circle kind of in this conversation back to risk inventory, what's happening in COVID, I think for all of us, in the beginning, we probably all saw information that came from bad actors saying that during COVID they were going to lay low. What we all know now is that has not been true. If anything, they have accelerated their efforts, and really, I think coming full circle back to what does that mean to risk? It means you're at some greater risk right now. We're seeing at Intermountain more organized fish attacks, more risk associated with that. We're doing more of our own internal phishing, and I think some suggestions, some ideas for our participants today is recognize this is going to happen and focus a couple of areas. I think in a framework that we've talked about, the NIST framework suggests us identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. If you focus some effort right now on detection, response, and recovery, and we've been talking about risk. Well, what is your risk in this period with these increased attacks? This a breach is a significant thing. So what I share with our leaders is we're going to focus time to make sure we can quickly detect, quickly respond, and quickly recover. And how do you do that? I would tell you, build in your cyber shop some key performance indicators and some watch metrics. Study and understand how long does it take you to determine the difference between an event and an incident. We've been tracking, we have history on that. I know how long it takes for me to distinguish events of interest from incidents. Study and analyze how long does it take you to discover. How long did it take you to discover years ago your first fish attack? How long does it take you to respond after you discover, and how long does it take you to recover? Those are metrics that I report to senior leaders inside Intermountain. What we're trying to do is hone to refine the playbooks that are associated with our detection, our response, and our recovery. We're looking, when an incident does occur, how long did it take us to find it? After we found it, that's the detection problem, and that's a metrics that I want to report to management. And then I want to know how long did it take me to respond, and how long to recover. And if your teams don't know the difference between response and recovery, that's your first problem. You've got to get this framework identified. You've got to get metrics and KPIs focused on fixing this issue and making sure that what happened to you at HS, it's going to happen to all of us. And what we've got to do is make sure we can respond, detect, respond, and recover quickly. So in the COVID time, focus your teams on processes, playbooks, KPIs, the watch metrics. How do you see it? How do you detect it?
There's a presumption here, though, that I just sort of overlooked. There's an HHS report from a couple of years back that said 75% of hospitals don't even have a designated security person. So are we ahead of the curve? So I mean, if you don't have a security person, we aren't even in the conversation. Don't know what Carl and Mitch and Marty and I are even talking about. So let's take a step back, and are you there yet? I mean, what's the maturation of your cybersecurity inside of your organization? Because if you don't have that, then maybe that's where you start. Maybe you first have to designate a person. If you can't afford a full-time person, you hire a fractional CISO. There's a lot of companies out there that can give you a fractional CISO that can start setting policy. But I'm amazed sometimes. I was kind of just sitting here thinking, I was like, maybe some people aren't even there yet. And so you're talking about, do I know what the difference in an event and an incident? Maybe not, because I don't have anybody there.
James, you're hitting the nail right on the head. And with Marty and team, I've been having some conversations around the idea of, before you go do the risk assessment, before you go get the inventory and data, you got to start with governance. And you're exactly right, James. Do I even have a CISO? And if I have a CISO, does that person know how to spell and how to talk? And do you have a structure where you can present the problem and you can get funding to, and that's the governance. And I've shared into the into the Sirius organization. That's a thing you've got to help people understand. And it's right what you're talking about, James, is I don't find that every organization even has the governance, the organization, the people to be able to tackle the elephant that's knocking them down.
Right.
And I was going to,
since we're
go ahead. Healthcare is the second largest targeted organization for ransomware. 10% of ransomware hits is hitting healthcare. So 15% hits manufacturing, 10% hitting healthcare. So we can't keep ignoring the elephant in the room. And if you're not, and so if we're not having that basic conversation, let's start there. And so absolutely, we have to start somewhere.
And security policies and governance that's in place just to get service up and running and extend out your resources to support your clinical staff. I mean, how does that affect IT security and your organization's security posture? You know, how can cybersecurity be ready to support rapid adoption and make sure certain processes are not circumvented just out of necessity?
That's always, the security will always run up against operations. I mean, security will always run up against day-to-day, you know, I mean, and I don't know how a security officer could say anything different, but okay, we'll help you stay in business. But and that's where I think Carl was absolutely spot on, though, is that you need to evaluate all of the what corners you are cutting when you do it, so that you can evaluate the risk of cutting that corner. If you're cutting a corner, you're doing something wrong. You know, there's a policy in place for some purpose. So we have to know what that risk is, and as a security officer, we have to be able to come back and say, okay, I get it. But by doing this, this is the increase of risk that you are accepting. Are you accepting this increased risk? And if they say yes, which they may be nodding along as a bobblehead, that's fine. But you are somewhat off the hook at that point in time, and the resume generating event is not going to be on your head.
I have to learn about that because when we had this happen, we shifted to what we call parallel mode, which means that we knew when devices were coming in, we knew when services were coming in or being deployed, and we did evaluations in parallel. And more importantly, we worked very closely with our customers during the very truncated procurement process. So security was in there taking a look very, very quickly. And yes, we did our research. We cut down our time significantly, but again, we have people on the team with background in med device cybersecurity. Your mileage may vary. Most organizations don't have a security officer. We got people that write books on IoT. So we were able to get in there, do an evaluation, and instead of giving the vendor time to develop a remediation plan, we literally said, okay, this is coming in on this date. This is the remediation plan we're going to deploy in parallel to getting this onto the network. So it's what can we do now to get this in, get this up and running, and meet the business objectives, and what can we put off?
Well, and I think what you also are pointing out is that at a larger hospital, you have those resources, and I think it's crucial for small and medium groups to make sure that they are networking on an information sharing initiative with those larger organizations. Leverage the knowledge that's in that area, and so I'm a big advocate of information sharing groups because, okay, you're right, I don't know how to do this, but usually security people want to help other people out. I mean, and so, you know, if you've kind of built the recipe, I think most people are willing to share that recipe, you know, on the short term. So,
and we've done a lot of that. And I'm also going to put in another plug here, given the fact that 75% of organizations don't have a named security officer. Many of those hospitals are members of the AHA, and the AHA has done a lot of reaching out over the past year in this regard. So I think part of the reason we haven't seen more attacks is because of the work they've been doing and basically calling up CEOs because they're the AHA and saying, here's things you need to do now.
Right.
Yeah, and I think as we look at this issue that really, Marty, you raised, how do we enable, how do we not become a barrier? COVID has forced us to do things that we all felt uncomfortable with. And whether you have a big or a small organization, all of us have been forced to move to a remote work environment. And what that has done is shifted healthcare. And I don't believe it will shift back. I think we'll see more of, and that is a future for us. I know that at Intermountain, prior to COVID, we had spent 2.5, 3 years on a strategy that was geared to transform, to digitize healthcare. We all have to be aware of those issues, those risks, and the pressure that it creates for us, because our natural answer, whether we're a small organization or a large, would be no. And not only no, but heck no, we won't allow, we're going to stay in the perimeter. But if you think of what remote is, and what is the transformation of healthcare, it really is a vision of any person, any place, any time. I spoke to a group of 50 healthcare CEOs of large healthcares. Every one of them is trying to do this, to transform healthcare, any person, any place, any time. If you wrestle with that vision for just a moment, or for a few hours, as I did with these CEOs, you have to come to the conclusion the data has to move. It has to go out of the perimeter and into the cloud. And what we have to do is overcome our natural tendency to say no. And this is all about leadership, I think. And so whatever your function is, if you're an IT leader, if you're a CISO, if you're the director, the leader of security, what you have to bring into your vocabulary is the idea, the concept of being an enabler. For my team, I put on the performance appraisal of every employee a goal. And the goal is that they will be an enabler. They will make security frictionless. And what that means to me is, and that's an interesting thing to have a CISO saying, because we're the ones who say, no, you can't, and I need these 15 controls. But what I'm telling my team is, and I'm helping them as well as the business understand, we must enable. The costs that have staggered and rocked healthcare in COVID are affecting all of us. All of us have had hundreds of billions of dollars of loss collectively, and that has to be overcome. And it's a political issue, this cost and being able to enable. So for healthcare to be successful, we've got to be enablers. Put that on the goals of your employees and teach them. When someone comes and says, this is what I want to do, instead of saying no, sit down and say, let me understand what you want to do, and let me help you find a safe, secure way, a privacy-enabled, a security-enabled way to do what you're asking. Don't say no. Show them how to do it correctly. And so for my team, I always tell them, don't come to me and say, I've got to say no. Don't tell me as a CISO I have to say no. Go find me the right way to do this. And that's an enabler.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it. I mean, we've had conversations around this before, right? It's my initial reaction as a partner and a vendor and working on the provider side for so long around, identity and security and EMR systems. It's my gut reaction is always, this is a bad idea and I want to say no to something. But that instantly shifted with COVID to let's figure out what we need the outcome to be and figure out how to get it done the right way without just instinctively saying no and, prohibiting any kind of enablement whatsoever, especially with the way things are going on. So one more question. My favorite subject, of course, identity and access management and governance. So identity is picking up steam again in healthcare. And I keep hearing identity is the new perimeter. And I agree with that statement, right? It's user identity gets compromised, all the technology, process, policy, everything you have in place can just go right out the window and an attacker can get in if the identity is compromised. So is traditional security becoming irrelevant? And is identity really the new perimeter and the key to securing an enterprise network?
I like that. I like the way it's stated that identity is the perimeter. I think that's why zero trust is, of course, gaining some love in healthcare, because even if they should lose that identity, you can mitigate the damages by behavioral analytics, making sure that that person shouldn't be doing X, Y, or Z. And that's why I think more AI, more machine learning type products will continue to take care of that. I don't I mean, the problem is passwords are the worst way to secure data. We're still using it because nobody wants to change, But multi-factor authentication, even three-factor authentication is becoming more of a thing, and segmentation of that identity. So even if I'm a sysadmin and I'm remotely logging in, there's only a few things I should be able to do if I remotely log in, and having a higher segmentation of that ability will prevent, for example, eBay got hit because some remote admin lost his password, and because of that, they got access to everything inside of that network. That's dumb. We should be able to segment. A remote access should only be so I can go in and access the access directory, or the Active Directory, and do one or two things. And so I think we just have to start really looking at what do we need to do, and if we don't need to do it, don't give it to them, and less trust based upon the identity.
And Marty, I don't think we could say we'll ever do away with the perimeter, but I use exactly the words that you have used, that identity is the perimeter of the future. And having said that, I have a perimeter team, and they work hand in glove with my identity team, but those two teams together, and through the perimeter team, I provide vast amounts of segmentation and micro-segmentation. And when you go back to the conversation we had earlier about how do you protect the critical asset of healthcare, which is the data, it's through segmentation and micro-segmentation. And then at access time, it's the identity. And to the things that James was just saying, if you look at mining and harvesting information about what is the role, what does the person who has this same function do, and using artificial intelligence and machine learning to say, today Carl is accessing a different set of data and his peers in the same function do this or do that. If we have those kinds of artificial intelligence machine learning systems, and more of those are becoming available commercially, where in the past 4 or 5 years, I've told my team, shift away from the traditional controls, and we've shifted 50% of our technical and physical controls to machine learning, artificial intelligence, looking at roles, looking at geolocation, looking at pattern-based approaches to say, what did this person do yesterday? What are they doing today? What does the role do? What does the geolocation allow? We collect, we harvest, we mine about 8 to 10 billion files per week to harvest this kinds of capability. And I think that's what the power of the identity gives us. And then having said that, I'm going to say what James didn't want to hear. I'm also working on passwordless at Intermountain, and I have about 200 people who are passwordless today. And I believe that's the wave of the future. And so we're looking to things like device authentication. If I come to my device, it authenticates me. I bring my phone near to my device, it authenticates me. When I walk away, my device locks up. When I come up, I can tap and facially scan into my device. So my password now is not a thing of the past. The keys, the tokens are in the background, they're being exchanged, but I use them a lot less today. And when I talked earlier about becoming frictionless, this was an idea my identity team had and said, what if we reduce the friction associated with a physician who has on average 20 to 25 credentials? Single sign-on started that, but then even after you single sign-on, I don't want to go in and out. So what we want to do is make that frictionless. Give them a device. We started with some YubiKeys. We're using thumbprints, facial. Now we use the phone. I can walk up to. I don't have to sign in. We make them sign in at least once a day, and it's a multi-factor. The device they have, the YubiKey, a fingerprint, and a credential. But once they've signed in, now I know this is them. What I want to be able to do is detect something when it comes and goes and get them in and out very quickly to all of our systems. So passwordless is a thing we should be doing to enable the business, to reduce the friction, increase the productivity of our caregivers.
And I can add on a final word there, and that is, yeah, Carl, you're absolutely right. Passwordless is, but the deal is identity is the new perimeter. And with mobile devices moving to that new IMT 2020 standard, better known as 5G, identity is going to be in that stack. So we have to get really good about our processes around identity provisioning, validation, and federation and I'm going to highlight federation as in the process by which an identity is provisioned and verified is just as important as the identity itself. And now it's going to extend directly to the devices, to your point. And yes, anyone that doesn't have at least a YubiKey at home and is doing passwordless at home needs to be doing so, because that is going to be the future.
Perfect. Well, gentlemen, you're all a wealth of knowledge, as always. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks all.